Good afternoon. About a month ago, I received I was asked, what are the current laws and regulations that apply to using emerging genetic technologies to recover extinct organisms? Oh, and by the way, release them into the wild. Well, that's a pretty complex question, but I think the answer is that there are very few laws that apply directly. But those that do apply, they have a really broad reach. And let's go into them a little bit. We need to ask, actually, how is public policy, including funding, influenced and developed, and how can we make public policy better for de-extinction? Well, what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, I hope, is I'm going to talk to you about a quick run-through on my Public Policy 101 course that I developed while I was working in the executive branch and in the Senate. Public policy really is a social science. When we get down to the bottom of it, it's a very great deal like political science, a great deal of politics and very little science. And there really are four ways that we can influence public policy. One, of course, is science, and that influences public policy. It's usually stereotyped as a hypothesis-driven, peer-reviewed, cyclical process, but in reality, in the modern world, modern science is very much like running a major corporation, you know, personnel, budgets, oversight by government, and so forth. The second of these things that influence public policy is a thing called TEK, Traditional Ecological Knowledge. Traditional ecological knowledge is something that a few groups of people still have and still get an opportunity to explore. People like ranchers, farmers, native peoples, commercial fishermen, people who live with and in nature, live with the seasons, they have TEK. Traditional ecological knowledge, and that can influence public policy, especially when it is examined and verified using Western scientific processes. The third of the ways to influence public policy is public opinion, and this is the hardest one, as you might expect, of the drivers of public policy to document and to verify, especially in a population such as ours that lacks TEK, where unfortunately we are represented by most of our citizens and most of our elected officials don't have much TEK in their background. And finally, the original question that I was asked, laws and regulations do affect public policy. It's really, and when we get down to it, a culture that is separate from and distinct from the laws of nature, and therein lie many, many, many of the conflicts. There's quite a bit of federal oversight if the genetically modified organism that we're talking about is near extinction or if it's likely to affect a commercially important species or if it's related to mankind. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 comes to most people's minds right away. It provides for the conservation of ecosystems on which the listed species depend, but in practice, the ecosystem is often ignored because of economic pressures. The California condor was down to, in 1982, was down to 22 specimens in the wild, but by 1987, the remaining condors had been taken up out of the wild, and they had been put into a captive breeding program. And today, those 22 birds that were taken into captivity have now become more than 400. And about 200 or so of them, once again, live in a much altered ecosystem back in the wild. Actually, I have to say that very little was done to improve the ecosystem while the entire population was in captivity, or since it was returned. Efforts instead seem to be going into managing it as a feral species, not as a living ecosystem plus the bird that lives in it. The purpose of the Endangered Species Act is to protect and recover listed species, and Section 4 of the Act specifies specifically how you list species and how you recover them. But recovery is probably impossible without understanding the ecological needs of the species and its fellow travelers in the ecosystem that it occupies. There's a cute bug, the American burying beetle. It was listed under the Endangered Species Act in 1989. It occupied at that time only about 1% of its original range. But the interesting thing about it is that its original range actually overlapped very nicely with the original range of the passenger pigeon, eastern deciduous forest. And there was quite a bit of speculation about whether, in fact, the fact that they overlapped in that manner had a symbiotic relationship between them. Actually, we need a lot more natural history and ecological information to recover the American burying beetle and to restore the passenger pigeon to its original range. I think we probably have lost the opportunity, actually, in the case of the passenger pigeon, to find out more about its natural history, but maybe not so for the American burying beetle. What the species needs is really its ecosystem. Existing federal oversight that affects directly genetically modified wild species is pretty much limited to a thing called the Coordinated Framework, 1986, which cobbles together existing laws under 3 different agencies. Agriculture has Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, which takes the Plant Protection Act and Executive Order 13112 to its use. Human environment is dealt with under EPA, and Food and Drug Administration deals with food and drug issues, all of them related to genetic issues. Oversight decisions by the agencies under these laws can be long, they can be tedious, but probably no longer and no more tedious than this slide is, so let's move on. This picture is from my front yard near Georgetown University here in the District of Columbia. And 3 species shown here prominently have had a huge impact on the eastern deciduous forest. And that same eastern deciduous forest, of course, was important for the passenger pigeon. You can see there the native deer. There are 3 in the picture if you look hard. You can see a non-native ivy and a non-native maple on the left. In these cases, the habitat has changed and supports the niches of the 3 species mentioned very well. All 3 of them are doing well. But this is not the case for the habitat needed by the passenger pigeon. There are a dozen 200-year-old chestnut oaks on the ridge, I agree, behind the picture here, but all the rest of it is highly modified second and third growth forest. Important to this discussion is the fact that Executive Order 13112 on invasive species has the full force of law, and it deals with an age-old issue called weeds. In the case of the executive order, species are defined as affecting the ecology, the economy, or human health. Essentially, they are weeds with a new entity, the ecosystem. Under the executive order, all agencies must detect and control populations within their budgetary authorities. And there is where the rubber meets the road. The ag community has been dealing with weeds for a long time. They have established mechanisms for funding and mechanisms for getting rid of weeds in their fight against weeds. The point is, the invasive species executive order affects only the ecology, and so it could potentially take funding away from the weed wars. The public policy in this case could stifle funding for genetically modified species that interfere with agriculture, and crop damage from passenger pigeons is one possible example. In March of '34, my father's brother was digging a ditch in Aurora, Illinois as part of a Civil Works Administration project during the Great Depression. Uncle Leo and his coworkers discovered mastodon and trumpeter swan bones in a layer of marl. This turned out to be one of the many such discoveries that established that both mastodons and trumpeter swans were widely distributed in North America during the Pleistocene. Well, While both species have declined in numbers tremendously, the mastodon has become extinct, and it would not fall under current wildlife laws. But due to a series of ironic accidents and the discovery of remnant populations, the trumpeter swan survived, and it was never listed on the ESA. There's much controversy about the management of the remaining trumpeter swan population, since the species is closely related to hunted species. Certainly, the trumpeter swan would be subject to the federal wildlife laws, including the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but not the ESA. In order to achieve the real good that de-extinction can bring to population management, including the management of the human population, it will require attention to 4 drivers of public policy. I believe that more plain old-fashioned knowledge derived from natural history and traditional ecological knowledge will open the door to good de-extinction public policy and additional funding for conservation in general. Thank you for your time.